Symbolic behaviour is the root of what makes us human. It represents our ability to think abstractly, communicate complex ideas, and create meaning in our communities. Symbolic behaviour is the cornerstone of human civilization, the foundation to our intellectual, social, and cultural evolution. It's what sets us apart from other animals and has allowed us to build a web of complex societies and rich cultural traditions all around the world. But when did this first begin? When did our ancestors begin to think, communicate, and express themselves beyond the means of just mere survival? From intricate cave paintings to ancient burials, join me as we delve into the origins of the symbols that shaped the very foundation of human civilization. Enjoy. By definition, symbolic behaviour is the capability of individuals to respond to or use significant symbols to create social reality. Some examples of symbolic behaviour in us modern humans are children's pretend play and make-believe scenarios, which involve using objects, actions, and vocalizations as symbols to represent different roles, situations, and narratives. Hand gestures like waving, pointing, or giving a thumbs up are symbolic representations with culturally understood meanings. Wedding ceremonies involve symbolic acts like exchanging rings, cutting the cake, and throwing the bouquet, representing commitment, fertility, and new beginnings. Religious rituals and practices such as baptism, communion, and meditation use symbolic actions and objects to represent spiritual concepts and beliefs. Cultural celebrations and festivals often incorporate symbolic dances, costumes, and performances to convey shared values, histories, and traditions. Paintings, sculptures, and other artistic expressions use symbols, metaphors, and representations to convey ideas, emotions, and meanings beyond the literal objects or materials used. Jewelry, clothing styles, tattoos, and body modifications often carry symbolic significance within a cultural context. Architectural designs, monuments, and religious structures frequently incorporate symbolic elements and iconography. Language is a form of symbolism, and, of course, death, something that us humans have obsessed about even before the start of civilization. These are examples that have been developed over tens of thousands of years. No, our ancient human ancestors probably weren't holding grand weddings or setting the latest fashion trends, but they were certainly doing something which eventually evolved into modern symbolic behaviour. It's extremely difficult to pinpoint exactly when symbolic behaviour first began to emerge, and the evidence we do have is extremely limited and leaves plenty of room for debate. But there is one member of our genus that would be a great place to start looking. Homo erectus was the longest reigning human species, beginning to merge roughly 2 million years ago, before dying out around 110,000 years ago. They were much more human-like than their predecessors, displaying several human-defining traits that set them apart from earlier hominins like Australopithecines and early Homo species like Homo habilis. They had larger brains, which were up to 1,200 cc, which is approaching modern human levels. They could run long distances and developed advanced hunting skills. They were likely hairless, with dark skin adapted for sun exposure. They were the first Homo species to control fire, which is arguably the most important step in our evolution. They also had advanced stone tool technology and widespread geographic distribution, meaning they were able to survive and adapt in different environments. With these modern human traits, the changes that took place in Homo erectus was a massive leap forwards in human evolution. With all this considered, it makes sense to begin our search for early symbolic behaviour here in Homo erectus. Our first taste of symbolic behaviour comes from the appearance of Achillean tools roughly 1.9 million years ago in Ethiopia. By 1.6 million years ago, the Achillean tradition of standardized symmetrical hand axes and cleavers became widespread and recognisable in East Africa, where it likely originated. Some researchers propose that the standardization of complex tool forms like hand axes across large regions would have required symbolic abilities like language to efficiently transmit and reinforce the conventional knowledge through the generations. Making Achillean tools such as hand axes required complex thought, long-term planning, and adaptability. The process involved multiple decisions at different stages, including selecting the right raw material, shaping it, and retouching it. They also suggest some kind of mental template, meaning they were made according to a plan or expectation of what a particular tool was supposed to look like or how it was supposed to be used. It would be hard to learn such a technique from just purely observation. The development of labels for the standardized hand axe and cleaver forms may have been the most efficient way to teach their complex production sequences. The transition to more sophisticated tools around 615,000 years ago, such as smaller Achillean tools, suggests an evolution in cognitive abilities. These tools were more precise and uniform, indicating further abstract thinking and planning. The selection of specific raw materials and the transport of these materials over long distances also hint at a level of foresight and possibly symbolic thought related to resource management and social connections such as trade with other groups. Although this clearly isn't direct evidence of symbolic behaviour, I'd like to raise the question of how these complex tools developed without some sort of symbolic culture. Even if it was simple body gestures, sounds, or even social norms. Tell me what you think in the comments below. It's a very, very sunny day today in South Wales. I am trying to look at the camera, but my eyes are absolutely getting ploughed by the sun right now, so I can't really see anything. I want to show you some examples of symbolic communication between species using no sort of verbal communication at all, just basically hand gestures. And I'm going to do that with the help of my oh so clever assistant, Ivor Jones. And he's going to help me show you how you can communicate with other species just using symbolic gestures. Yeah, let's do it. It's going to be fun.
Oh, you're such a good boy. Who's a good boy? Yes, you are.
So as you can see, at least firstly, I was able to communicate very effectively just by using hand gestures. And that's something we're able to apply to our ancestors a little bit, because if I'm able to communicate with my dog that effectively, that easily, just using hand gestures, it makes you think what our other human species like Homo erectus and Neanderthals were able to do without any verbal communication. You know, the subject of if they had language was very debated, but even without language, surely they was able to communicate a lot more effective than I just was able to with my dog, just by using hand gestures. So yeah, it helps us realise that, you know, symbolic communication is, well, very easy to do, and very easy to do with different species as well. In 1891, Dutch anatomist Eugene Dubois discovered fossils of Homo erectus, along with animal remains and shells, in Trinil on the banks of Bengawan Solo River in Java. Among the shells collected by Dubois were at least 166 individual freshwater mussels. In a recent study, researchers noticed a zigzag pattern engraved on one of the mussel shells from Dubois' collection. Using two dating methods, the engraved shell was determined to be between 430 and 540,000 years old, making it the oldest known engravings by a human ancestor. The engraving was likely made by Homo erectus using a shark tooth or another sharp tool. Reproducing the pattern experimentally required significant skill and effort. Another shell from the collection appeared to have been modified into a cutting or scraping tool, suggesting Homo erectus used the shells as tools in addition to engraving on them. Engraved patterns and markings on bones and shells from sites like Trinil in Java and Bilzenslegen in Germany, dating back to around 500,000 years ago, have been interpreted by some researchers as among the earliest examples of symbolic or artistic expression by Homo erectus. Did they mark the shells as a sort of doodle, or was it a mark to claim the shell as the individual's property? We will honestly never know, but it doesn't seem to have any practical use that we know of, suggesting the capability of symbolic thought and action in Homo erectus. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence for symbolic behaviour in Neanderthals is their practice of burying their dead. Unlike other animals, which usually abandon their deceased members, Neanderthals seem to have buried their dead in graves. This suggests they had a concept of life and death, and possibly even an early ritual or belief system, making a profound cognitive leap in human evolution. While some scientists remain skeptical, the accumulating evidence across Europe and Asia strongly support this idea. The Neanderthal burials at La Forêt, a cave located in southwestern France, are some of the most compelling pieces of evidence for intentional burial practices among Neanderthals. A total of 8 different remains have been discovered between 1909 and 1921, including adults, children, and infants, which provided critical insights into how Neanderthals treated their dead. The remains of the individuals at La Forêt, particularly 2 adult skeletons, were found in deliberate and consistent positions. The male adult was placed on his back, with legs flexed at the knees. This careful arrangement suggests the body was positioned intentionally after death. Similarly, a female skeleton was also laid on her side, with a comparable flexed leg position. This positioning indicates a thoughtful arrangement of the body, rather than accidental burial. The discovery of multiple child and infant burials at the site adds to the evidence of ritualistic or deliberate burial. One of the most notable finds is that of an infant's grave, where the child's remains were found in a small, isolated pit. The burial of the infant in a separate, smaller grave may reflect the particular significance Neanderthals attached to infants, either out of emotional concern or symbolic meaning. The decision to bury an infant in a specially dug grave, rather than leaving their body exposed, highlights the potential for symbolic thinking, even for young members of the group. The graves themselves were clearly dug, with depressions and outlines that were distinct from natural features of the cave. The male and female skeletons that I first mentioned were placed in shallow graves, indicating the Neanderthals had the capacity and motivation to dig burial pits. The presence of stones arranged around the graves of some individuals hints at some form of grave marking or protection, a possible ritualistic or symbolic behaviour, though, unfortunately, like many other things in archaeology, this remains a matter of debate. Something that is important to note is that the bodies at the site showed minimal evidence of carnivore activity or scavenging, which would likely have been present if the bodies were left on the surface for any significant length of time. This lack of disturbance suggests the bodies were quickly buried after death, supporting the idea of purposeful burial. The site also contained Mousterian stone tools and other cultural artifacts typical of Neanderthal occupation, though no grave goods were found directly associated with the bodies. However, the proximity of tools and other remains to the burials indicates that the site was used regularly by Neanderthals. While some anthropologists hesitate to assign symbolic meaning to Neanderthal burials, the repeated pattern of burial practices at La Forêt provides a strong argument for symbolic or ritual behaviour. The fact that these burials occurred over an extended period of time suggests that they were part of a learned and culturally transmitted practice rather than just an isolated behaviour. Although there is little in opposition to the burial at La Forêt, Some researchers argue that even if Neanderthals buried their dead, the burials may have been pragmatic rather than symbolic. Bodies may have been buried simply to keep them away from predators or to prevent the spread of disease within living areas, rather than as part of a ritual or symbolic practice. I personally think this view sort of dehumanises Neanderthals, and I think that because we know that Neanderthals were emotionally intelligent and emotionally expressive. You know, they created music, they created art, and they cared for one another, as we see with Shanidar 1. So I definitely think death would have impacted Neanderthals, especially if it was in their group. You know, we're talking about close family members here, or at least someone that you've been raised with most of your life. And they definitely would have mourned their dead. To say that they buried their dead, I don't think is a far reach at all, especially when we consider the evidence in front of us. So I think to say, even if they were burying their dead, that it was only for practical purposes and not a symbolic purpose is a very dehumanising way to view Neanderthals, and I don't think it's the right way to view them at all. I think they were definitely burying their dead intentionally, whether that was to help with mourning or whether that was to help their relatives pass on into the afterlife. We will never truly know. But I think what we do know is that they were burying them with a purpose, and that purpose was a symbolic purpose, and we can't necessarily narrow that right down, but we know, or at least I think we know, that it had an emotional connection, that it wasn't just a practical purpose to prevent disease or to prevent attracting predators. So I think Neanderthals were burying their dead out of respect and to help with their mourning. The Neanderthal burials at Shanidar Cave in Iraq have been central to the debate over whether Neanderthals practiced intentional burial and exhibited symbolic behaviours. Excavations led by Ralph Slavesky between 1951 and 1960 uncovered 10 Neanderthal individuals, with evidence suggesting intentional burial, care for the disabled, and even ritualistic behaviours. However, these interpretations have been challenged, with skeptics offering alternative explanations for the evidence. The remains of at least 10 Neanderthals were found at Shanidar Cave, including adult males, females, and infants. The positioning of these bodies, particularly Shanidar 1, 2, 3, and 4, indicated intentional burial. The bodies were found in distinct positions, such as flexed or supine, which suggests they were deliberately placed in graves rather than left to decay naturally. Some people argue that the positioning of the Neanderthal bodies at Shanidar could have occurred through natural processes, such as the collapse of cave walls or sedimentation, rather than intentional burial. Over time, natural forces could have created the appearance of a deliberate placement. Erosion, sediment movement, or rock falls could have caused the bodies to be buried without the need for intentional human activity. Critics suggest that the careful positioning of the bodies could have been coincidental, a result of how the bodies were preserved by sedimentary processes. Researchers found fire beds and animal remains buried under rock falls, and even the skeletons of 2 Neanderthal adults were found crushed under boulders, which may have fallen and killed them. I always hate the other side of the coin in these discussions, because sometimes it can actually disprove the point that you want to believe is true. In this case, it doesn't necessarily disprove the fact that Neanderthals buried their dead, but it does make a viable argument, especially in the case of Shanidar Cave. So the other side of the coin, like we discussed, debates the fact that Neanderthals were buried by their own tribe members, and instead points towards more natural causes, like rock falls. And it's a perfectly viable opinion to have, because throughout the occupation of Shanidar Cave, we know that rock falls happened, and we've even found some skeletons that may have been crushed by rock falls in the cave. So to say the burials at Shanidar Cave were buried by natural causes, cave-ins, rock falls, things like that, is a perfectly viable opinion. But not one I want to believe personally. And it's not just Shanidar Cave that we can point towards for the evidence, but in the case of Shanidar Cave anyway, to keep it specific, I do think that the tribe members were burying their dead. Maybe we have a few separate cases where it was unintentional burial and they were crushed underneath rocks. But I think for the most part that the people at Shanidar Cave were definitely burying their deceased. But it's a perfectly viable opinion to think otherwise. And in all seriousness, we have to consider all sides of the arguments and all possibilities, and that may not be what we want to be true, but in the case of archaeology, the archaeology doesn't lie, it can only be misinterpreted, so we have to consider all interpretations, and only that way can we find the actual definite truth. So maybe the Neanderthals at Shanidar Cave were or weren't burying their dead, and with research still ongoing at the site, hopefully we find a definite answer soon. But that's not all Shanidar Cave has to offer in terms of evidence for symbolic thought in Neanderthals. The discovery of Shanidar 4 led to the famous flower burial hypothesis. Archaeologist Ralph Selesky argued that pollen around the remains indicated that Neanderthals placed flowers on or near their dead, which would suggest symbolic or ritualistic behaviour. Pollen from several plant species was found in the soil surrounding the remains of Shanidar 4, including species such as yarrow, groundsel, cornflower, and grape hyacinth. Some of these plants have medicinal or symbolic associations in various human cultures, strengthening the idea that they may have been deliberately selected. This has led some researchers to propose that the flowers could have been placed with Shanidar 4 not only as a symbolic gesture, but possibly for medicinal purposes, perhaps as part of a healing ritual for the deceased. However, this interpretation has been widely debated, with critics suggesting alternative, natural explanations for the pollen. Critics argue that the presence of pollen could be explained by natural means, such as wind or water flow, which might have transported pollen into the cave after the body was buried. This could account for the range of pollen found in the soil without requiring human intervention. Another explanation suggests that burrowing animals such as rodents or bees may have inadvertently introduced pollen into the burial site. Rodents could have carried pollen from outside into the cave as they moved through the soil near the burial. Another rebuttal to point out is that other Neanderthal burial sites do not show similar evidence of flower pollen, suggesting that Shanidar 4 might be an anomaly. The absence of comparable pollen evidence in other Neanderthal burials weakens the case for flower placement as a widespread cultural practice, increasing the likelihood that the pollen that was found was a result of natural occurrences as opposed to a deliberate placement. I'm sure we'd all like to believe that Shanidar 4 was buried with a pretty bunch of flowers placed by their family, but honestly who knows for sure. It seems to me at least that the critics are right on this one. There's just not enough evidence to suggest that Neanderthals were burying their dead with flowers, especially the absence of flower burials in other Neanderthal cultures and at Shanidar as well. I think that it's a much more realistic belief to think that the pollen occurred on the grave through natural causes. You know, bees, rodents, wind, water, things like that. But you never know, that might change with time. We might find more flower burials that are more concrete in the evidence of a placement. But it would be really nice to think, wouldn't it, that Neanderthals were burying their dead with flowers. It's so humanizing almost. And we already know, we've discussed many times on the channel how human and emotionally intelligent Neanderthals were. But to think they're burying their dead with flowers is just something more empathetic about it, I suppose. They're burying their dead with flowers out of a sign of mourning and respect. Which is a beautiful thing to think, but unfortunately in this case I don't believe it to be true. And even if you don't subscribe to the belief that Neanderthals buried their dead, the evidence of Neanderthal art, like cave paintings, the use of jewellery and the use of pigments, suggests that Neanderthals had a capacity for abstract and symbolic expression, so it's undeniable really. I don't want to make this video too long, but if you do want to learn about the things I just talked about, like art, jewellery, use of pigments, and even caring for one another, I have a Neanderthal documentary that's over an hour long. It's a bloody good video if I say so myself, and I definitely recommend you go and watch it. Staying on the topic of burials, I want to briefly touch upon two amazing burial sites that show astounding signs of symbolic and abstract thinking in our own species, Homo sapiens. Kafsa cave located in Israel has yielded multiple burials of Homo sapien individuals, including both adults and children. The most notable burial at Kafsa is Kafsa 9, a young adolescent buried with red deer antlers placed on the chest. Red deer were powerful animals and likely represented strength, vitality, and life force. In many ancient cultures, antlers were symbols of vigour and resilience, qualities deeply respected by hunter-gatherer communities. By placing red deer antlers with the deceased, early Homo sapiens may have intended to bestow these attributes upon the individual in death, or symbolically in an afterlife. Other grave goods were also found at the site, specifically red pigments, which were found in multiple graves. The symbolic use of pigments in these burials suggests an early understanding of colour symbolism, likely indicating an attempt to mark the occasion, celebrate the life of the deceased, or perhaps prepare the individual for an afterlife journey. The Skull Caves, also located in Israel, hold several burials, including one particularly famous burial known as Skull 5. Skull 5, an adult male, was buried with the mandible of a wild boar placed alongside him. Wild boars are strong, resilient animals that are difficult to hunt due to their strength and aggressive nature. Like the red deer, boars are represented in many cultures, symbolizing courage, ferocity, and survival. By placing a boar mandible alongside Skull 5, it's likely that the community intended to endow the deceased with these qualities in death, perhaps to empower or protect him in an afterlife. Or alternatively, the inclusion of the boar mandible in the burial suggests that early Homo sapiens viewed certain animals as symbolic guides, or as beings capable of bridging the physical and spiritual worlds. Many later cultures believed that animals held the power to protect or accompany humans into the afterlife, acting as guides or intermediaries in the journey beyond death. The burial at Skull Cave could be the early beginnings of these beliefs. These sites are a clear representation of early ritualistic behaviour in our species that would eventually spiral into the countless unique and widespread abstract beliefs that shape the very societies we live in today. There are so many other amazing early Homo sapien burial sites that I could talk about, but I don't want to make this video too long. Let me know if you want me to make a specific video about these sites in the comments below. The explosion of art, symbolism, and abstract thinking in Homo sapiens during the Upper Paleolithic marks one of the most remarkable cultural shifts in human history. This period, beginning roughly 40,000 years ago, saw an unprecedented production of art, with Homo sapiens creating complex symbolic representations in caves across Europe. The famous paintings at Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain are some of the best examples of this profound shift in human creativity. The Lascaux cave paintings, created around 17,000 years ago, contain over 600 paintings and thousands of engravings that depict animals like horses, bison, deer, and aurochs. The Hall of Bulls, one of the cave's most notable sections, features large, dynamic animals that seem to move across the walls. Located near the cave's entrance, the hall is about 20 meters long and about 5.5 meters wide, with towering, sweeping walls covered in images that display remarkable skill, precision, and symbolic depth. The bulls, which measure up to 5.2 meters long, are the largest animals in the cave, giving the chamber its name. Each animal is depicted in varying poses, some in motion and others at rest, creating an illusion of movement across the walls. The artists used overlapping lines and shapes to give the impression of depth, which is rare in prehistoric art. For example, some animals appear behind others, creating a sense of layering that makes the compositions more realistic and visually engaging. The paintings are in rich shades of black, brown, red, and yellow, achieved through the use of manganese, iron oxide, and charcoal. Many researchers believe the Hall of Bulls may have served as a ceremonial function, possibly linked to hunting magic or fertility rituals, intended to ensure a successful hunt or abundance of game animals. The massive scale and careful placement of the animals suggests that the painting held symbolic or spiritual significance. These are truly remarkable improvements of bringing abstract thought into reality, compared to what our previous human relatives achieved. And of course, with us Homo sapiens able to develop our ability to express these abstract thoughts in such advanced ways, more advanced symbolism followed. The Altamira cave paintings in northern Spain are celebrated for their vibrant colours, impressive realism, and symbolic depth, offering insights into the worldview and cultural values of the Paleolithic artists who created them around 36,000 years ago. Like the paintings at Lascaux, the Altamira artwork is more than a mere representation. It embodies symbolic themes reflecting early Homo sapiens' relationship with nature, their beliefs, and perhaps even spiritual practices. The most prominent figures in the Altamira cave paintings are large, dynamic bison depicted in vivid red, black, and brown. These animals, often shown with great musculature and realistic poses, appear to convey a sense of strength, endurance, and perhaps abundance. Bison may symbolize essential resources, embodying the importance of successful hunts to survival and prosperity. Some bison appear in a recumbent position, possibly wounded or at rest, which might represent the life and death cycle, integral to hunting societies. The colours may have had symbolic meanings, with red possibly signifying vitality, blood, or life force. The vividness of these colours emphasises the importance of these animals to the artists, suggesting a connection that goes beyond practical hunting needs to encompass reverence or even spiritual significance. The cave paintings at Altamira and Lascaux convey symbolic meaning tied to survival, reverence for nature, and possibly spiritual or totemic beliefs. Through careful choice of animals, vivid colours, spatial arrangement, and dynamic poses, the artists at Altamira expressed a complex worldview that merged the physical and spiritual, life and death, and individual identity with the community. This symbolic art reflects the capacity of Homo sapiens to use abstract thinking and visual expression to communicate beliefs and values, showing the depth of human cognitive and cultural evolution. While interpretations are complex and ongoing, certain archaeological findings, like some of the ones we have covered, strongly suggest ritual behaviours, proto-religious beliefs, and symbolic uses of objects and ceremonies. But even though cultures separated by mountains and oceans all around the world had their own way of displaying these behaviours, there is still something that connects nearly all of them: colour. Red ochre, to be specific. Red ochre holds profound significance in early Homo sapien cultures globally, appearing across continents in burial sites, rock art, ritual artifacts, and as body paint. It is among the most ancient pigments used by humans, symbolising life, death, and spirituality in ways that suggests a deep connection to cultural and ritual practices. In Africa, we find engraved ochre pieces and ochre-stained shells, suggesting ritual use and possibly early symbolic expression through engravings. In Europe, red ochre was used to paint animals in geometric shapes, likely serving as a medium for ritualistic and shamanistic representations. In Asia, ochre was applied to burial sites, suggesting continuity in symbolic burial practices. Across Asia, ochre also appears in early art forms, signalling its broader cultural and ritual importance. In Australia, Aboriginal Australians have used red ochre for at least 40,000 years, often in rock art and body painting. Ochre is still integral to Aboriginal cultures, used in ceremonies that connect people with their ancestors and the land. Its use across generations highlights its enduring cultural importance. In South America, red ochre was used to create hand stencils. The handprints likely symbolise group identity, social status, or personal connection, reflecting ochre's broader role in marking individual or communal identity. And finally, in North America, red ochre appears in burial sites across the continent, including Paleo-Indian sites like the Windover in Florida. Its use in mortuary practices across indigenous cultures reflects a shared symbolic association with the transition between life and death. Red ochre use in early Homo sapiens societies shows that it was one of the first materials to hold symbolic meaning globally. As a universal tool for expression, ritual, and social identity, red ochre's importance across the continent is a great example of the shared human drive to find and use symbols to represent life, community, spirituality, and the natural world. This deep-rooted significance paved the way for complex social practices, spiritual beliefs, and the evolution of symbolic thought that would become foundational to human culture. So, to conclude, what have we actually learned about the development of early symbolic behaviour? Well, we've learned that symbolic behaviour plays a crucial role in the transmission of knowledge, the formation of social bonds, and the development of complex social structures. By enabling early humans to represent ideas, communicate social practices, and differentiate social groups, symbolic behaviour created a foundation for everything, from language and art to governance and moral codes. The ability to create, interpret, and share symbols helped the Homo lineage form clans, mark territories, and pass down knowledge in ways that fundamentally shaped human society, underscoring its role as a defining feature of human civilization. Thanks for watching.